The HMS Leopard's cannons thundered across the Chesapeake Bay on June 22, 1807, forever changing the course of American history. What began as a routine naval encounter between the British warship and the USS Chesapeake would ignite a flame of resentment that burned for 5 long years before exploding into full-scale war. Captain James, Baron of the Chesapeake, had refused the British demand to search his vessel for deserters. Royal Navy sailors who had fled the harsh conditions of British service for the promise of better treatment aboard American ships. The Leopard's response was swift and devastating. 3 broadsides that killed 3 Americans and wounded 18 others, leaving the Chesapeake crippled and humiliated. As British officers boarded the American frigate and dragged away for men, the young United States faced a brutal reality, despite winning independence 30 years earlier. Britain still treated America like a colonial possession. Thomas Jefferson's administration seethed with indignation, but the nation was ill-prepared for war. The American Navy consisted of merely 16 vessels, compared to Britain's overwhelming fleet of over 600 ships. Jefferson chose economic warfare instead, implementing the Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited American ships from trading with foreign nations. Strategy backfired spectacularly, crippling American commerce while barely affecting British trade. By 1809, James Madison inherited Jefferson's foreign policy nightmare. The British continued their practice of impressment, forcibly recruiting American sailors into the Royal Navy under the pretense that they were British subjects. Conservative estimates suggested that over 6,000 American sailors had been pressed into British service, though some historians place the number much higher. Each seized sailor represented not just a personal tragedy, but a national humiliation that festered in the American consciousness. The situation deteriorated further as Britain's war with Napoleon reached its zenith. The Royal Navy's orders and council effectively blockaded European ports, strangling American trade and forcing neutral vessels to obtain licenses from British authorities. American merchants watched helplessly as their ships were seized and their cargoes confiscated. The once thriving American maritime economy staggered under these restrictions, with exports plummeting from $108 million in 1807 to $22 million by 1808. Madison faced mounting pressure from a new generation of congressmen dubbed the War Hawks by their opponents, led by the charismatic Henry Clay of Kentucky and the fierce John Calhoun of South Carolina. These young politicians had grown up after the Revolution and felt no deference toward Britain. They viewed British actions not merely as trade disputes, but as assaults on American sovereignty that demanded a military response. The War Hawks saw opportunity beyond the Atlantic grievances. British agents in Canada were suspected of arming and encouraging Native American tribes along the frontier, leading to increased violence in territories like Indiana and Illinois. Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, had forged a confederation of tribes, united against American expansion, and many Americans believed British support emboldened this resistance. The promise of conquering Canada, Jefferson had famously called it a mere matter of marching, appealed to expansionist ambitions, while potentially eliminating British influence in North America. As 1811 drew to a close, Madison could no longer ignore the clamor for action. The choice before him seemed stark: submit to British maritime dominance and accept national humiliation, or declare war against the world's most powerful navy with America's own modest fleet and untested army. The decision that would define his presidency and America's place in the world loomed inevitable. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Capitol as President James Madison prepared to address Congress on June 1, 1812. The diminutive Virginian, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing little more than 100 pounds, carried the weight of a nation's future on his shoulders. His war message would either secure American independence once and for all, or lead the young republic to catastrophic defeat against the British Empire. Madison's voice carried across the packed chamber as he methodically outlined British transgressions. The impressment of American sailors continued unabated, with British naval officers treating American citizenship papers as worthless scraps. The orders in council still strangled American commerce, forcing merchants to seek British licenses. like colonial subjects begging permission from their masters. Most damning of all, evidence mounted of British collusion with hostile Native American tribes on the frontier, according to historical records from the National Archives. Madison's war message emphasized how British agents had supplied weapons, an encouragement to Tecumseh's Confederation, directly contributing to frontier violence that had claimed hundreds of American lives. The president painted a picture of a nation under siege, tacked on the seas by British warships, economically strangled by British trade restrictions, and threatened on land by British armed Native Americans. The debate that followed revealed a nation deeply divided. Federalist congressmen, primarily from New England, argued that war would destroy what remained of American commerce and leave the nation defenseless against British retaliation. They pointed to Britain's successful resistance against Napoleon as evidence of the empire's invincibility. Josiah Quincy of Massachusetts warned, "War would bring the flames of your cities and the blood of your citizens while accomplishing nothing but national ruin." The Warhawks responded with passionate appeals to national honor. Henry Clay declared that the nation's choice lay between the base submission to the orders and council, and impressment or manly resistance. John Calhoun argued that continued submission would reduce America to a mere appendage to British power, forever dependent on British goodwill for economic survival. The young nation's honor, they insisted, mattered more than short-term commercial considerations. Behind closed doors, military preparations revealed America's dangerous unpreparedness. The regular army consisted of fewer than 7,000 men, many stationed at remote frontier posts. The Navy's 16 vessels faced a Royal Navy of over 1,000 ships, including more than 100 ships of the line massive warships that could obliterate entire American squadrons. Coastal fortifications remained incomplete in state. Militias varied wildly in training and equipment, yet the Warhawks pressed forward with infectious optimism. Canada's population of only 500,000 seemed an easy target for a nation of 7.5 million Americans. How British forces in Canada numbered fewer than 5,000 regulars, stretched across an enormous territory from Halifax to Detroit. The conquest of Canada would eliminate British an influence in North America while providing valuable territory for American expansion. The congressional vote on June 18th revealed the nation's ambivalence about war. The House of Representatives approved the declaration by 17-9 votes to 49, while the Senate barely passed it by 19-13. No previous American war had begun with such a narrow margin of support, reflecting deep regional and political divisions that would plague the entire conflict. Madison signed the declaration that evening, making the United States the first nation to declare war on Great Britain in over a decade. The decision surprised British officials, who had recently repealed the Orders in Council in response to economic pressure. News of this concession wouldn't reach America for weeks, arriving too late to prevent the war that both sides had stumbled into almost by accident. As word spread across the nation, reactions varied dramatically by region. In Baltimore and other maritime cities, crowds cheered the prospect of capturing British merchant ships as prizes. New England merchants mourned the death of profitable trade with Britain and her colonies. On the frontier, settlers prepared for intensified Indian warfare, while ambitious officers dreamed of glory in the conquest of Canada. The die was cast. America had declared war on the world's greatest naval power with a fleet of 16 ships. The first shots of the war echoed across the Detroit River on July 12, 1812, but not as American strategists had envisioned. Instead of triumphant American forces sweeping into Canada, Brigadier General William Hull found himself trapped in Detroit, surrounded by a smaller British and Native American force that had outmaneuvered him at every turn. Hull's invasion of Canada had begun with high hopes on July 12th, leading 2,000 men across the Detroit River. He issued a proclamation promising to liberate Canadians from British tyranny and threatening severe punishment for any who fought alongside Native Americans. The proclamation backfired spectacularly, alienating potential Canadian allies while providing British commanders with perfect propaganda material. Instead of welcoming American liberators, Canadian militia rallied to defend their homes against foreign invasion. Major General Isaac Brock, the British commander in Upper Canada, recognized that bold action could compensate for his numerical disadvantage. The tall, charismatic officer had spent years preparing for American invasion. Fortifying key positions and cultivating alliances with Native American leaders, his partnership with Tecumseh proved decisive. As the Shawnee Chiefs warriors controlled the wilderness routes that Hull's forces needed for communication and supply, the psychological warfare began immediately. Brock and Tecumseh orchestrated a campaign of raids and ambushes that convinced Hull he faced overwhelming enemy forces. When Captain Nathan Heald evacuated Fort Dearborn, modern-day Chicago, on August 15th, Potawatomi warriors attacked the retreating garrison, killing 53 soldiers and civilians in what became known as the Fort Dearborn Massacre. News of the disaster shattered Hull's confidence and convinced him that a vast Native American army threatened his supply lines. Brock's masterstroke came on August 15th when he crossed the Detroit River with barely 700 regulars and 400 militia. Facing Hull's 2,000 defenders behind Detroit's walls, Brock relied on deception rather than force. He dressed his militia in military uniforms to inflate his apparent strength and had Tecumseh's warriors march repeatedly through areas visible to American sentries, creating the illusion of thousands of Native American allies. The ruse worked perfectly. Hull, already demoralized by frontier defeats and cut off from reinforcements, surrendered Detroit without firing a shot on August 16th. The capitulation stunned Americans and electrified British morale throughout Canada. Brock had captured an entire American army along with the Michigan Territory, while cementing the British Native American alliance that would dominate the war's early phase. While Hull's army marched into captivity, American naval forces provided unexpected hope. On the Atlantic, the USS Constitution, commanded by Captain Isaac Hull, the general's nephew, encountered HMS Guerriere on August 19th, 500 miles east of Boston. As documented in the Naval War College's historical archives, the engagement demonstrated that American frigates, though fewer in number, possessed advantages in size, firepower, and crew training that could overcome British naval superiority in single combat. The Constitution's 44 guns battered the Guerriere's 38, with American 18-pound shot proving devastatingly effective against the British frigates. Lighter construction. When British cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the Constitution's thick oak sides, an American sailor allegedly shouted, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron," giving birth to the ship's nickname, Old Ironsides. After 30 minutes of combat, the Guerriere was a dismasted wreck, forced to surrender with 79 casualties compared to the Constitution's 14. The victory electrified American morale just when Hull's surrender had threatened to crush national confidence. Newspapers across the country celebrated the defeat of a British frigate by an American vessel, proving that Britannia's rule of the waves was not absolute. Captain Hull received a gold medal from Congress, while his crew shared $50,000 in prize money, a fortune that attracted volunteers to American naval service. The Constitution's triumph was followed by another stunning victory. On October 25th, when Captain Stephen Decatur's USS United States captured HMS Macedonian after a brutal 90-minute battle, the Macedonian, though badly damaged, was salvaged and sailed to New York as a prize, the first British frigate ever brought into an American port. Crowds lined the waterfront to cheer this tangible proof of American naval prowess. These naval victories provided crucial psychological benefits during a period of military disasters on land. They proved that American forces could defeat British regulars in fair combat, encouraging recruitment and maintaining public support for the war. More importantly, they demonstrated that Britain's naval supremacy, while overwhelming in numbers, was not insurmountable when American ships could engage on favorable terms. As 1812 ended, the war's character was already clear. American forces would struggle on land against professional British troops and their Native American allies, but could achieve spectacular successes at sea when circumstances allowed. Single-ship encounters. The thunderous roar of cannons echoed across Lake Erie on September 10, 1813, as Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's makeshift fleet engaged the British squadron in one of the war's most decisive battles. Perry had spent months constructing vessels from green timber at Presque Isle. Racing against time to challenge British control of the Great Lakes before winter ice ended the sailing season, the Battle of Lake Erie began at dawn with Perry's flagship, the USS Lawrence, leading 9 American vessels against 6 British ships commanded by Captain Robert Harriet Berkeley. The Lawrence bore the brunt of British fire, suffering catastrophic damage as Perry refused to retreat. When his flagship became a floating wreck with 83 of her crew killed or wounded, Perry transferred his command flag to the USS Niagara and continued the fight. The turning point came when Perry sailed the Niagara directly through the British line, delivering devastating broadsides that forced the entire enemy squadron to surrender. His famous dispatch to General William Henry Harrison captured American jubilation. "We have met the enemy and they are ours." The victory gave Americans control of Lake Erie and severed British supply lines to Detroit, setting the stage for the reconquest of Michigan Territory. Harrison's subsequent invasion of Canada demonstrated how naval control transformed land operations. With British forces cut off from reinforcement and supply, General Henry Proctor abandoned Detroit and retreated toward Niagara. Harrison pursued with 4,000 troops, including Kentucky Mounted Infantry, eager for revenge against British allied Native Americans who had terrorized the frontier. The climactic battle occurred at Moraviantown on October 5, 1813. Proctor's 700 British regulars and 500 Native American warriors, led by Tecumseh himself, made a desperate stand along the Thames River. Harrison's cavalry charge shattered the British line within minutes, while Tecumseh fell, fighting among his warriors. The Shawnee chief's death effectively ended the Native American Confederation that had dominated the northwestern frontier since the war's beginning. According to military historians at the Smithsonian Institution, Tecumseh's death marked a turning point in relations between Native Americans and the United States. Without his charismatic leadership, tribal resistance collapsed throughout the Old Northwest, opening vast territories to American settlement and eliminating British influence south of the Great Lakes, while Americans celebrated victories in the Northwest. British strategy underwent fundamental changes following Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig in October 1813. With French power crumbling in Europe, Britain could finally redirect significant military resources to North America. Troop ships began carrying Wellington's Peninsula War veterans across the Atlantic. Had fought from Spain to Waterloo. The British offensive began in 1814 with coordinated attacks, designed to force American surrender through overwhelming pressure. Admiral Alexander Cochrane's fleet imposed a devastating blockade of American ports, while General Robert Ross prepared to lead 4,000 veterans in an assault on Washington itself. The plan's audacity reflected British confidence that American resistance would crumble when faced with professional European warfare. Ross's expedition landed at Benedict, Maryland, on August 19, 1814, beginning a rapid advance toward the American capital. General William Winder assembled nearly 7,000 militia and regulars at Bladensburg, Maryland, but the hastily organized force collapsed when faced with British discipline and experience. The Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th became known as the Bladensburg Races, as American forces fled in panic, leaving the road to Washington. ENDFENDED. President Madison and his cabinet evacuated the capital as British columns approached. First Lady Dolly Madison became a national heroine by saving George Washington's portrait and important government documents before fleeing the executive mansion. Her courage provided one of the few bright moments in a humiliating national disaster. British forces entered Washington that evening, finding a deserted city whose government had fled. Ross ordered the systematic burning of public buildings in retaliation for American destruction of York, Toronto the previous year. The Capitol, Executive, Mansion, Treasury, and other government buildings were set ablaze, creating an inferno visible for miles. Admiral George Cockburn allegedly declared that Americans would remember this lesson for 50 years. The burning of Washington shocked Americans and Europeans alike. Many British observers criticized the destruction as barbaric, while American newspapers called it proof of British tyranny. The attack strengthened American resolve rather than breaking it. Citizens rallied to defend their independence against what they saw as renewed British attempts at conquest. As smoke rose from the ruins of their capital, Americans faced their darkest hour of the war. British forces controlled the Chesapeake Bay, threatened Baltimore, and prepared new offensives against New York and New Orleans. The young republic's survival hung in the balance as professional British armies sought to reverse the verdict of the American Revolution itself. The pre-dawn darkness of September 13th, 1814, was shattered by the thunderous bombardment of Fort McHenry as 16 British warships unleashed their fury upon Baltimore's last defense. Francis Scott Key, 35-year-old lawyer detained aboard the HMS Minden during a prisoner exchange, watched helplessly as rocket fire and mortar shells arced through the night sky toward the star-shaped fortress guarding Baltimore's harbor. British assault on Baltimore represented their attempt to deliver a knockout blow following the burning of Washington. Major General Robert Ross had been killed by American sharpshooters during the approach march. But his successor pressed forward with 4,000 veterans, determined to capture America's third-largest city. Baltimore's defenders, commanded by Major George Armistead, had spent weeks preparing for siege, strengthening Fort McHenry's walls, and assembling a garrison of 1,000 determined men. The naval bombardment began at sunrise on September 13th with British bomb ships anchoring just beyond the range of American cannons. For 25 hours, they poured a devastating fire into the fort, launching over 1,500 shells and rockets in one of the war's most sustained artillery attacks. The garrison endured this hell while returning sporadic fire, their smaller guns unable to reach the British fleet positioned 2.5 miles away. Key spent that sleepless night watching the bombardment from the British fleet, knowing that Fort McHenry's fall would doom Baltimore to the same fate as Washington. The rocket's red glare illuminated the American flag flying defiantly above the fort, while bursting shells proved that the garrison still held out. As recorded in the Maryland Historical Society's archives, Armistead had commissioned a massive flag measuring 30 feet by 42 feet specifically so it could be seen clearly from British ships, ensuring that both sides would know whether the fort had surrendered. Dawn on September 14th revealed the great garrison flag still flying over Fort McHenry's ramparts. The British bombardment had failed to breach the fort's defenses or break American morale, while simultaneous land attacks had been repulsed with heavy losses. Admiral Alexander Cochrane ordered the fleet to withdraw, abandoning the assault on Baltimore as too costly to continue. Key's relief and jubilation inspired him to pen verses on the back of a letter, capturing the emotions of that historic night. His poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry, later renamed The Star-Spangled Banner, expressed the resilience and determination that had carried America through its darkest hours. The successful defense of Baltimore proved that American forces could withstand the best efforts of Wellington's veterans, marking a psychological turning point in national confidence, while Baltimore celebrated its deliverance, an even more dramatic campaign unfolded along the Gulf Coast as Major General Andrew Jackson prepared to defend New Orleans against the largest British expedition of the entire war. Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane and Lieutenant General Edward Pakenham had assembled over 10,000 troops, including elite units from the Peninsular campaigns, for an assault designed to seize control of the Mississippi River and split the United States in half. Jackson reached New Orleans on December 2nd, 1814, finding the city's defenses in chaos. The Creole population remained lukewarm toward American rule, having been acquired through the Louisiana Purchase only. 11 years earlier, local militia units were poorly equipped and trained, while regular army reinforcements remained scattered across the vast Louisiana territory. The general's response demonstrated the iron will that had earned him the nickname Old Hickory. Jackson declared martial law, suspended habeas corpus, and began fortifying every approach to the city. He welcomed reinforcements from unlikely sources, including Jean Lafitte's pirates from Barataria Bay and free men of color whose military service challenged prevailing racial assumptions. When Louisiana's governor questioned his authority, Jackson reportedly declared that he would rather fight the British than argue with politicians. British forces began landing at Lake Borgne on December 14th, establishing a base 60 miles from New Orleans for their advance on the city. Pakenham's plan called for a direct assault on Jackson's positions, relying on European tactics that had proven successful from Spain to France. The British general fatally underestimated both the strength of American defenses and the determination of Jackson's diverse army. The preliminary skirmishing began on December 23rd, when Jackson launched a night attack against the British advance guard, inflicting significant casualties while demonstrating American aggressiveness. This action convinced Pakenham that he faced a formidable opponent, leading to more cautious British movements that gave Jackson additional time to strengthen his defensive positions along the Rodriguez Canal. Jackson's main line stretched across the narrow strip of land between the Mississippi River and an impenetrable cypress swamp, forcing any British attack into a frontal assault against prepared positions. The Americans built a massive earthwork reinforced with cotton bales, creating firing positions for artillery pieces ranging from naval guns to Lafitte's pirate cannons. Behind this formidable barrier waited over 4,000 defenders representing the war's most diverse American army. As 1814 ended, both sides prepared for the climactic battle that would determine the fate of New Orleans and potentially the entire war. Pakenham's veterans had never failed to carry enemy positions through direct assault, while Jackson's motley force had never faced such professional opposition. The morning mist clung to the Chalmette plantation as dawn broke on January 8th, 1815, revealing the crimson ranks of British infantry formed in perfect battle array. Lieutenant General Edward Pakenham's 8,000 veterans stood ready for the assault that would decide the fate of New Orleans. Their bayonets gleaming in the pale sunlight as drums beat the cadence of European warfare. Across the Rodriguez Canal, Major General Andrew Jackson watched the British preparations from behind his improvised ramparts. The Tennessee general had transformed a modest ditch and earthwork into a fortress bristling with artillery, defended by the most diverse army in American military history. Regular soldiers stood alongside militia, pirates fought beside planters, and free men of color served next to white volunteers in a coalition united only by determination to defend New Orleans. The British plan appeared flawlessly conceived. Colonel William Thornton would lead 1,200 men across the Mississippi River to capture the American batteries on the west bank, then turn their guns against Jackson's main line. Meanwhile, Pakenham would launch the primary assault with two massive columns. Major General John Keene's division advancing along the river road, while Major General Samuel Gibbs led the main attack against the American left center. Thornton's river crossing immediately encountered delays that would prove fatal to British hopes. Strong currents and insufficient boats meant his force didn't reach the west bank until after the main battle began, arriving too late to provide crucial artillery support. The British assault would proceed without the covering fire that Pakenham's plan required for success. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, British artillery opened the bombardment intended to silence American guns and breach Jackson's earthworks. The exchange quickly revealed American advantages in both position and firepower. Jackson's artillery, commanded by the experienced Dominique U and other former pirates, responded with devastating accuracy that dismounted British guns and disrupted their infantry formations. According to battlefield accounts preserved in the Louisiana Historical Society, the effectiveness of American artillery surprised even Jackson's defenders. The pirate gunners, accustomed to naval combat, demonstrated remarkable skill in land warfare, while regular Army artillery officers coordinated a crossfire that turned the open field before the American lines into a killing ground. Pakenham ordered the main assault at 7:30. Sending his columns forward in the grand style that had carried British arms to victory across Europe. The sight of veteran regiments advancing with colors flying and fifes playing stirred even American hearts with its martial splendor. These were the soldiers who had defeated Napoleon's marshals, marching with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. The American response shattered British confidence within minutes. Jackson had positioned his troops in three ranks behind the earthworks, creating continuous volleys that swept the advancing columns like a scythe through wheat. Kentucky riflemen, famous for their marksmanship, picked off British officers with deadly precision, while Tennessee volunteers poured devastating fire into the packed ranks of redcoats. The carnage was unprecedented in American military experience. British soldiers fell in windrows as they struggled across muddy fields churned by artillery fire. Colonel Robert Rennie's light infantry briefly gained a foothold on the American ramparts near the river, but were immediately overwhelmed and killed to a man. The main columns never reached the American lines, breaking under fire that no European army could have endured. Pakenham himself fell mortally wounded while trying to rally his broken divisions, struck down by grapeshot as he rode forward to restore the attack. Major General Gibbs died leading his men in a desperate charge, while Major General Keane suffered severe wounds that ended his military career. The British Army lost its entire command structure within 30 minutes of beginning the assault. The slaughter ended by 9 o'clock as surviving British forces retreated beyond artillery range, leaving the field covered with red-coated bodies. American casualties totaled 13 killed and 58 wounded, while British losses exceeded 2,000 killed, wounded, and captured. No battle in American history had produced such a lopsided victory against such formidable opponents. The Battle of New Orleans created instant legends that would shape American identity for generations. Jackson became a national hero whose political future was secured by his military triumph. The diverse nature of his army regulars and militia, pirates and planters, white and black soldiers, fighting together, embodied democratic ideals that distinguished America from the class-conscious societies of Europe. News of the victory reached Washington in February, arriving almost simultaneously with word that American and British negotiators had signed a peace treaty at Ghent on December 24, 1814. The timing created the lasting myth that Jackson's victory had secured better peace terms. Though the treaty had actually been concluded before the battle occurred, the irony of fighting the war's greatest battle after peace had been signed epitomized. The entire conflict, a war that both sides had stumbled into, was fought with mixed success and concluded without clear victory. Yet New Orleans provided Americans with the triumphant ending they needed to remember the War of 1812 as a successful defense of national independence rather than a series of military disasters punctuated by occasional naval victories. Ancient Flemish city of Ghent provided an unlikely setting for negotiations that would reshape the relationship between Britain and the United States. In the medieval charter house of the Carthusian monastery, 5 American commissioners faced their British counterparts across polished oak tables, each side carrying instructions that seemed to make compromise impossible. The British delegation arrived in August 1814 with demands that reflected their nation's dominant military position. Admiral James Gambier, Henry Goulburn, and William Adams insisted on creating an independent Native American state in the Old Northwest Territory, permanent British navigation rights on the Mississippi River, and American territorial concessions along the Canadian border. Most humiliating of all, they demanded that Americans abandon their claims to fishing rights and British North American waters rights that New England had considered sacred since colonial times. John Quincy Adams led the American delegation with characteristic New England stubbornness, refusing to surrender any territory or maritime rights that his nation had possessed before the war. The son of former President John Adams brought formidable diplomatic experience to the negotiations, having served as minister to Prussia, Russia, and the Netherlands. His colleagues Albert Gallatin, Henry Clay, Jonathan Russell, and James Bayard represented different regions and political philosophies, but united in their determination to preserve American independence. The negotiations stalled through the autumn as military campaigns raged across North America. British victories at Washington and ongoing campaigns against Baltimore and New York strengthened their negotiating position, while American naval successes on the Great Lakes demonstrated that the war's outcome remained uncertain. Both sides recognized that battlefield developments ultimately determined the peace terms more than diplomatic arguments. As documented in the British Foreign Office records, the turning point came with news of the failed British assault on Baltimore and the successful American defense of Lake Champlain at the Battle of Plattsburgh on September 11, 1814. Commodore Thomas Macdonough's naval victory on Lake Champlain forced British land forces to abandon their invasion of New York, convincing London that the war had become too costly to continue for uncertain gains. British public opinion, increasingly, opposed a war that consumed enormous resources while producing few tangible benefits. The conflict cost Britain over £32 million, while imposing heavy taxation on a population already exhausted by 20 years of warfare against France. Merchants demanded restoration of American trade, while military leaders questioned the wisdom of maintaining large armies in a North American wilderness when European affairs required immediate attention. The news of Andrew Jackson's crushing victory at New Orleans reached Europe in March 1815, after the peace treaty had been signed, but before it was ratified by both governments. Jackson's triumph provided Americans with psychological vindication that transformed their perception of the war's outcome. Even though it occurred after the peace negotiations had concluded, the victory convinced Americans that they had successfully defended their independence against the world's greatest military power. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, essentially restored the status quo ante bellum era, turning all conquered territories to their pre-war owners without addressing the maritime issues that had caused the conflict. Neither impressment nor neutral rights received explicit mention. In the treaty, as both sides agreed to resume relations based on pre-war conditions, the treaty established joint commissions to resolve boundary disputes and provided for the restoration of Native American rights, though this latter provision was largely ignored by the United States. The treaty's most significant provisions concerned future relations between Britain and the United States. Both nations agreed to work toward ending the international slave trade, while establishing the principle that future disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 would demilitarize the Great Lakes, creating the world's longest undefended border, and establishing a precedent for peaceful coexistence. News of the treaty reached New York on February 11th, 1815, setting off celebrations throughout the American states. Church bells rang from Boston to Savannah as citizens gathered to hear public readings of the peace terms. The Senate ratified the treaty unanimously on February 17th, formally ending a conflict that had tested American independence and national unity more severely than any previous crisis. The War of 1812's conclusion marked the beginning of a new era in Anglo-American relations. Britain never again challenged American sovereignty or territorial integrity. While the United States gradually abandoned its alignment with France in favor of practical cooperation with its former mother country, the war's end allowed both nations to focus on domestic development and territorial expansion rather than mutual antagonism. For Americans, the war's psychological impact far exceeded its military or diplomatic achievements. The successful defense against British invasion, symbolized by Jackson's victory at New Orleans and the survival of Fort McHenry, convinced citizens that their democratic experiment could withstand any external threat. The conflict produced a generation of political leaders including Jackson, William Henry Harrison, and Zachary Taylor, whose military reputations would shape American politics for decades. The war that began with American humiliation at Detroit and reached its nadir with the burning of Washington ultimately ended with a sense of national triumph that helped forge a truly American identity distinct from both British and European models. Though neither side achieved its war aims, the United States emerged with renewed confidence in its institutions and destiny. While Britain accepted American independence as an irreversible fact of international relations, the complete narrative draws from primary sources, including the National Archives, state historical societies, and contemporary military records to present an authentic account of this pivotal conflict in American history.